So here's what I thought I would do. There is a general background conversation as I take it here in this conference and a former conference about the relation between philosophy and economics. And like many of you, I think these two, and I include economics within the realm of social sciences, more generally speaking, these two should form an alliance for the purpose of a grounded, a progressive, and what I, in Frankfurt talk, would call a critical theory, even though the critical theory topic came up, and I'm happy it did, in Jean-Michel's panel yesterday. So what I thought I would do is to ask or think with you about what a realistic conception of transnational justice would be, assuming that grounding philosophy with the help of the social sciences leads to some form of realism, though that may be wrong. It might be the case that whenever philosophy is involved, realism is gone. At least that's what many social scientists think. Some philosophers think as soon as some social scientists apply their methods, realism is gone. So we'll see how that goes. I will start with a few remarks about realist turns in political philosophy, which I think are a little problematic. And in my more constructive parts, I'll focus on a topic that has been mentioned and discussed in this conference, but that I think complements rather than is at the core of the capability approach. And I mean the topic of identifying and overcoming structural injustice. And I think that could be an occasion to talk about the relation between a certain view of structural injustice or justice and the capability approach and what it has to say about it. So in the longer version of the paper, I discuss some critiques of realism in political science areas such as international relation. By realism, they mean mostly work in the tradition of Morgenthau, where you take the existence of power relations, of structures of domination as they are, and you try to change things to the better by finding ways to influence power to the better and to give arguments to what is seen to be prudent statecraft to change things in a more stable, peaceful, and possibly just way. So that kind of realism has come under attack in areas such as international relations, whereas in philosophy we see a reverse movement, namely a number of realisms that have come up, and many of these stem from a certain dissatisfaction with ideal approaches in philosophy, such as that of John Rawls, and I think Amartya's book on the idea of justice is one such realist critique of Rawls, even though it's not one of the realisms I want to criticize, at least not today. I've done other work where Amartya and Martha are the objects of critique, and I thought I'd spare you with this today. Now, Rawls himself, however, in his book on the Law of Peoples, initiated a realist turn. In the Law of Peoples, he deals with questions raised by the international system. He calls the theory realistically utopian. It's utopian insofar as it delineates a normatively justified world in which liberal and well-ordered peoples treat each other fairly, but it's realistic in rejecting the assumption that the relevant rules of fairness can stem from the self-understanding of liberal societies. That's an important theoretical orientation because now liberal theory can no longer aim at a comprehensive program of justification. Rather, it leads at best to what Rawls calls the principles of the foreign policy of liberal societies. And here you see the realist idea of the statesman, informed by clever philosophers, sets the tone. This kind of realism states that we, in accordance with the fact of pluralism of different societies and cultures, have to reckon with different, we being liberals, have to reckon with different perspectives that we cannot entirely comprehend. This is an important aspect of contemporary versions of normative realism, the idea of cultural difference and of the incommensurability of worldviews. Second, in recent work on human rights, such as especially by Chuck Bites, but also Joseph Raz and others, we encounter another aspect of realistic political theory, and that stresses the immanence to practice. If we want to understand the idea of human rights, according to Bites, we must not adhere to an abstract model of such rights, but instead adopt a practical and functionalist approach that reconstructs the role played by human rights in an international normative order. Third, in contemporary philosophy, there is another source of realism, in addition to the emphasis on cultural difference and the autonomy of legal and political practices. It's nourished by impulses from a Nietzschean critique of morality and insists on the categorical difference between morality and politics. These approaches defend the autonomy of politics against, so to speak, colonizing claims of morality or justice. In the version we find in Bernard Williams, realist political theory asserts that the question of order is the first question of politics. A political mode of social coexistence is one among beings who cannot agree on any shared system of morality or justice. The most that can be aspired to is a generally acceptable and legitimate order, of a peaceful order. According to Raymond Geuss, another realist political philosopher, philosophy should not be based on an assumption of idealized rational beings. Instead, it should proceed from historically situated and concrete real motivations within a game of interests and power that cannot be transcended in the direction of an ideal theory. So far, so good. So what's the problem about these realisms? A lot of it sounds quite plausible. I think these realisms have aspects to them which are unrealistic. So, Rawls. Who would dispute, given the many well-founded criticisms of Western ethnocentrism as the continuation of colonialism with theoretical means, that the cultural idea of difference is of major importance? It's one of Rawls's merits to have taken this up. But his theory loses sight of reality, I think, the moment it makes peoples into normative entities which form sociocultural, almost personalized units that could agree on principles of international cooperation. In the process, it loses sight of what is primarily at stake in questions of transnational justice, namely norms and institutions that respond to the problems rooted, in the first place, in the fact that neither peoples, nor societies, nor states are uniform, but instead are plural entities, and in particular ones pervaded by conflict, domination, and oppression. Second, it must be noted that contemporary societies are parts of complex systems of control and cooperation, marked by extremely asymmetric participation and profit structures. A theory of transnational justice that is realistic must be responsive to these realities of asymmetrical structural global transnational relations. And this is what it needs to focus on. It must reconstruct the reality of national, transnational, and international ruling structures and conflict structures. That's what it should focus on, not on idealized units of peoples making contracts. One must bemoan here, I think, another dead end into which the idea of cultural difference in a certain liberal understanding leads, but we cannot accuse Rawls directly of that. He used the notion of an overlapping consensus not as a grounding notion, as one of justification, but one of stability, explaining stability. But many have taken the idea of an overlapping consensus to be a grounding notion, to ground a theory of justice, human rights, and what have you on it. But if you look at it, that is a remarkable idea, which I think also passes reality by. It often leads to a very minimal list of, say, human rights, because you think the overlapping consensus is too thin, too narrow, to have a more expansive list of human rights, and I'll come back to that problem. More importantly, it's unclear what kind of consensus actually is supposed to exist when values or principles are shared, but the reasons for them are not shared. So the idea of the notion of consensus here is already quite shaky. It's just an overlap. It's not a consensus. Furthermore, it's not clear how we actually establish the existence of such an overlapping consensus. It's not an empirical consensus, not an existing consensus. It's a counterfactual, it's a hypothetical consensus. So who's going to be part of that consensus and what is not? So that is a quite shaky notion, I think, especially if you apply it, as some have done, Charles Taylor and others, in the global intercultural realm. Finally, ask yourself how plausible it is really to have an imaginary or real universal overlapping consensus decide which human rights, for example, are valid. Who would have hit upon the idea, for example, of grounding the droit de l'homme et du citoyen in an overlapping consensus of the time? Or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in an overlapping consensus of the 1940s? And who would have the idea of telling protesters, wherever they are, in Tiananmen Square, or those protesting against the starvation wages of a multinational oil company in Nigeria, for example, or those protesting patriarchy and violence against women in India or Germany, or wherever it happens, and it happens everywhere, that they should keep in mind that their demands for justice and human rights exceed the minimal intersection of an intercultural overlapping consensus that could be agreed between representative of world regions, religions, and cultures. Who would have that idea? Here the danger is of exchanging diplomatic considerations for normative thinking, and the image of the statesman or the philosopher advising the statesman reappears in that form of realism. I don't think this is how we should think about what it means to ground human rights. In this way, in typical Frankfurt speak, I would say supposed realism becomes inverted into a form of affirmative thinking. The intention to proceed in a realistic way from the fact of sociocultural pluralism ends in speechlessness towards the actual reality, the reality of social conflicts and struggles, where participants raise strong moral claims, claims that are not raised by philosophy or the West or Western philosophy, but by those involved and affected themselves who are rebelling against an existing normative order, be it patriarchal or tyrannical or oppressive in a traditionalist or a capitalist way. That's just what human rights are about, to give a voice to those who protest against such forms of oppression. So these claims must be taken seriously from a normative perspective of the participants, and a critical theory of human rights has to have an access to that perspective of the participants as dissidents and protesters. If one overlooks this, even the critique of ethnocentrism that is rightly raised by different sides, not just by post-colonial theories, can become inverted into its opposite, into the idea that human rights are, for example, a purely Western idea, or a possession of the West, or of the Christian West, which is a funny idea if you look at the history of Christianity, that it should be the birthplace of human rights. The birthplace of human rights were those who protested against oppressive forms of Christian normative orders. That's the birthplace, but not Christianity. It's the dissenters who reinterpret it, using a certain notion of justice and rights as soon as it appeared, to reinterpret fundamental notions of that faith. If we thought human rights were a Western idea, we would exclude protesters in non-Western societies from that language, and I think that is a mistake. A few words on Beitz's and Raas's normative practice approach. It is true that when we think about human rights, we should be close to the practice of human rights and the social contexts in which they arise, their claims arise, and in which they are realized. But if, like Beitz and Raas do, one sees the essential function of human rights as being to urge states to observe basic norms governing the treatment of their members, which is right, and if one stresses further that non-compliance with these norms justifies intervention by the world community in one form or another, then one easily finds oneself on a slippery slope. For one might then easily succumb to the inference that an extensive interpretation and definition of human rights could open the floodgates to all kinds of interventions by interested parties who, moreover, all too often invoke morality. And the result is you reduce the list of core human rights because you think human rights should only be those where the violation of could legitimately, with good reasons, lead to an intervention. So if you think that way, you come to a reduced notion of human rights. But such a position confuses different questions. The question of human rights and the legitimacy of states from the perspective of their citizens, and by contrast, the question of the external sovereignty of a state and of reasons for legitimate external intervention are two different questions. However intertwined these questions are, they must be answered separately. The scope and justification of human rights is one thing. The question of who can legitimately intervene when they are violated is another question. It is just another question. That they're often short-circuited in practice doesn't mean that in theory we have to follow that short circuit. When it comes to defining the function of human rights, they should be seen instead in their original political and social context, where they secure the basic status of free and equal persons not subject to others' arbitrary will. Sounds Petidian, I'll say in a moment why it is not. This status guarantees the standing of individuals as full members of a political community. In this way, a human right to democratic participation cannot just be, but has to be justifiable, a right placed in question by a number of minimalist theories of human rights who do not count the right to democratic participation among the core human rights, and I think that is a mistake. International political theory is mistaken when it assumes the position of a global adjudicator who, and I exaggerate here, would understand human rights in the sense of minimal compromise formulas and would connect the validity of human rights too closely with the legitimacy of interventions. That would mean not according adequate weight to the reality of the struggles for human rights in different states, not taking sufficiently into account the perspective of those affected, who have enough of being kept in leading strings by their government and do not want to be liberated or patronized by Western countries either. If political science wants to be realistic, it must develop the perspective and logic of these struggles and claims. So a few words on the third form of realism by Williams and Goethe. It is true that politics is not applied ethics, if that would mean ignoring political realities. Those who, like Peter Singer, for example, postulate individual duties to assist, conceived in utilitarian terms as a response to systematically engendered world poverty, neglect the structural injustice of asymmetrical, transnational, and international relations, which are the cause of persistent disadvantage and underdevelopment. And I make here a causal claim, and I make this throughout the paper, and I will come back to it, and that's surely a topic for our discussion, whether you economists and social scientists, those in the room, think that is too much of a claim to make. Would be too bad, but you never know. Those who first construct a beautiful, unworldly, ideal theory in such a way that it would have to be implemented by wise statesmen or insightful citizens overlook not only the contingency of the political world and its non-predictability, but also a fundamental principle in politics, that of autonomy. Politics is neither the space of technically correctly applied morality, nor of the prudent creation of order. Rather, it is the space in which the question of the justification of a political order is posed in such a way that it is at once a philosophical and a practical question. And this is one of the main ideas of the critical theory connection between theory and practice, which I base my thoughts on. It is the question of those, the question of justification is the question of those who are subjected to rule or domination. It's the question of the justification of such rule, which, reflexively speaking, includes in the first place the demand to create a practice of political justification by those affected as justificatory equals. A politics of justice is a matter of establishing relations of justification in which those who were subjected to rule can be the justification authorities of this rule. That's the principle of justification which I have in mind, and it calls for reflexively examined justification of democratic structures of rule. And it is a principle that enters the political world, which, in my view, is as much a moral as a political, a universal as a historical, a rational as an emotional principle. It states that only those social or political relations can be called just and sufficiently legitimate that can be justified by those who are subjected to them themselves as the agents of justification. That's the idea here. The idea is confirmed by Bernard Williams, actually, and I think more Nilly than Willy. Is that an English expression? Nolens, more Nolens than Volens. Good. Sorry, by the way, for subjecting you to my English. That's also why I read. If I go on speaking loosely, it's even worse. Williams introduces the basic political legitimation demand, as he calls it, which requires that political rule must always be able to justify itself towards those subjected to it. When he explains the criterion of acceptability to each subject, he adds what he calls, alluding to Habermas, and it's great to see Bernard Williams as an ally in critical theory, he adds the critical theory principle, namely, and I quote, that the acceptance of a justification does not count if the acceptance itself is produced by the coercive power which is supposedly being justified. That is a true principle. I think it is a principle of critique, of justification, and of practical reason in a Kantian way, and Bernard Williams would have never accepted a Kantian interpretation of that principle, but that's just what it is. Norms that claim to apply to you as valid and binding have to be based on reasons which you, as a free and equal normative authority, cannot reject, given that others have a similar claim as free and equal to the validity of these norms. Whether you call that principle moral or political or rational, I really don't care. It's all of that. Depending on the nature of the norms and principles which are to be justifiable. But I think inherent in this principle, if it is a principle of practical reason, is a right, namely the right to justification, which David was so kind to mention, the right to demand a justification for every normative order and every norm that applies to you, that claims to be valid over you, that claims to be binding you, and that claims to subject you to a certain form of action. It is, of course, the principle of autonomy, of not having to live under a system of norms that cannot be fully justified to you as free and equal. And I think it is a discursive principle, because justification doesn't mean that justifications are handed to you by someone else. It is justifications which you have co-produced, which you are part of, which derive from you as an equal to others. So here's the place, I think, for a discursive interpretation of the capability approach, the capabilities to be a justificatory agent in a particular social setting, in a particular political context. There are a number of rights, powers, and capabilities, and I prefer to think of capabilities as powers, those that empower you to be a justificatory agent. And there are a number of capabilities which are important here. But see that now I use the notion of capabilities separated from a notion of well-being, because these are the capabilities of being someone who is not subjected to a normative order that is not fully justifiable to you. So there's a strong moral imperative here, but it's not one of well-being. It's about the dignity of not having to live under a system that is not justifiable to you. That should be conducive to your well-being, but that's not in the foreground of the argument. Augustine and others thought that well-being is much furthered if you are not a justificatory autonomous agent, but follow the words of God. So I think there's a problem here when it comes to the dignity of equals. Whether there's a problem here when it comes to the notion of well-being, I don't know. Augustine knew a lot about well-being. So we'll have a chance to discuss this when Henry raises his remarks. So I have to speed up. Realists are right to warn, as Goethe does, that morality itself can degenerate into an ideology. Hans Morgenthau, the old realist, already warned against the sinful pride of declaring one's own values to be universally valid and enforcing them, as he says, with blind crusading zeal. But realism can also turn into a technocratic ideology when it places itself at the service of the wise statesman who upholds supposed national interests, or when one confuses questions of justification with diplomatic questions, or overlooks what is at stake in politics. Politics has the task of building, extending, and maintaining the institutions necessary for a just social order. It must always submit to its inherent justification imperative, the imperative that only those who are subjected to rule have the authority to generate through fair justification procedures the legitimations that they can recognize as free and equal persons. The principle of justification is the normative foundation of a critical, realistic treatment of politics. It does not fit comfortably with the perspective of world rulers, but instead develops the participant perspective on political discourses and struggles as a normative perspective, which takes its orientation from the question of justification. A critical, realistic form of constructivism, and I won't go into what I mean by constructivism here, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it, builds on this. It's not a constructivism that thinks we construct the normative world. It's just a constructivism that says we construct the normative world between us. Whether there is a Platonic Platonic world of real values behind there, which we come closer through our finite constructions, I don't know, and I don't know who would know. So we leave that aside.
Delphic Oracle.
Right, exactly. I like Oracle, yeah. Okay, so it's a perspective immanent to practice, but it's a perspective transcending practice, of course, because the principle of justification always cuts through the justifications that we have produced by always reflexively asking who took part in that justification, which reasons have been taken up, in what way, what were the dominant forms of discourse, or to use Gramscian language that Jay used yesterday, what were the hegemonic forms of discourse? So it is an immanent as well as a transcending principle. The main idea of dignity here is that you are a justificatory authority just like everyone else, and no one can produce a justification for you if it violates that status of being a justificatory equal. Now, what does that mean in transnational contexts? I think critical realism here has two essential components. The first is the normative component. It consists in no other basis than the right to justification. The question of rule you are subjected to remains central, not as a free play of forces, but in the context of the struggle for adequate relations of justification. So the first requirement of justice, and in my work on justice I've built on that, a theory of justice, as the rejection and avoidance of arbitrary, that is unjustifiable rule, that is domination, and as the establishment of democratic forms of political justice. And I'd say that my notion of arbitrary rule is not one that is an arbitrary interference with your realm of freedom of choice, which is Philip's notion. Arbitrary rule for me is rule that is not justifiable between equals, and where justification procedures, institutions, are not in place in the first place. They're just not there. So there's a double form of domination, being subjected to unjustifiable rule and being subjected to a normative order where there is no possibility of raising critique and producing justifications. So my notion of non-domination is a discourse theoretical notion. It doesn't focus on the realm of freedom of choice that is being left to you. It focuses on your status and your standing as a justificatory equal. So it is a Kantian notion, and I think, well, Philip isn't here, so we can't discuss here. The second component of a realistic account of transnational injustice or justice is an empirical one. And here, the relation between philosophy and the social sciences and economics comes in. since the question of justifications always aims at actually existing relations of rule or domination. The question of justice and democracy in transnational context must begin by making an inventory of the precise contexts in which transnational and international rule or domination is exercised. Therefore, the study does not begin in ideal space or with an ideal model of the world state, but with an analysis of the complex interconnections between national, transnational, and international relations of rule. It asks whether there exists corresponding adequate relations of justification to these forms of rule, that is, ones which are adequate to the level and quality of rule being exercised. This is a practice immanent, but not a positivist approach that concentrated on international cooperation or the self-image of political functional elites. Rather, in accordance with the principle that every exercise of rule should be legitimized in relations of justification, a critical theory of transnational discursive justice must begin by reconstructing the most important economic, legal, and political relations of rule or domination. Frankly, as every Frankfurter must say, mostly domination, not rule, formal or informal. In this context, national, regional, transnational, as well as international and supranational contexts should be connected in the right way, in an empirical analysis and in the corresponding conception of justification structures. So we start from an analysis of the existing forms of asymmetrical forms of rule, of domination, of what I call injustice. And that's where philosophers just cannot do the work anymore. They have to rely on sociology, on political economy, economics, to inform them about what's going on in the production circles, in the market chains that are laid over our world. Now, how do we think about a notion of transnational justice? Are states no longer the essential actors? Who are the agents here? Well, yes, states are, in the first place, still essential actors. However, reflexive forms of participation must be sought that prevent these actors from dominating parts of their own population or other states or parts of other states. As a result, where existing supranational, international, and transnational organizations reproduce specific relations of domination, they can only provide the starting point for more participatory and reflexive political forms, which means that corresponding fora must be opened up for opposition parties from states, civil society actors, such as are organized, for example, in the World Social Forum, and I know that many of you are in touch or actually work for non-governmental organizations which have which perform similar functions. The first task of justice is to establish political structures in which arbitrary rule can be banished and in which those who are subjected to rule or domination, be it economic, political, or legal in nature, can bring the force towards the better argument to bear against those who exercise such rule or domination. I say the force towards the better argument, and Henry will pick up on this, because you all know the Habermasian formulation of the force of the better argument. My version of it is a bit more polemical. The force towards the better argument doesn't make sure that the better argument succeeds. It just is a polemical practice of forcing those who thrive on privileges to show, well, actually, you have to show it, that there's no justification for it. There is just no justification for these privileges. I think democracy as a practice of justice acquires special importance in this context. In the first place, it must be liberated from the narrow alternative, world state or world of states. Did you hold up the 5 now? Okay, thank you. That's actually reassuring, so I can take a... We must liberate our thoughts from the narrow alternative world state or world of states, which haunts much of international political theory and philosophy. Because we have to understand democracy as a normative order in which those who are subjected to rule or norms should be the normative authority. Thus, the question of the relevant community of justification, the famous demos question, is answered in terms of the existing structures of rule, and the question of co-determination and of the requisite institutional form is answered in accordance with the nature and degree of existing forms of being subjecting to such rule. So where there is transnational rule or domination, democracy must find a way to overturn these asymmetrical or non-justifiable forms. So that's where a demos is already established, through subjection, not through some will of forming a good community. Because by being subjected to existing forms of rule, whether economic or political, you already have been made into a community of non-justification, but you should, as democratic agents, overturn this and transform yourself into a community of justification. Democratic rule is a discursively justified form of rule, which means one in which there are structures of justification which are adequate to the scale of the rule exercised. This already extends the question of democratic rule conceptually beyond national borders, depending on what relations of rule a state is embedded in, whether as ruled or as ruler, and in complex systems, actually, it is both of that. So, principle of political proportionality would say that a structure of justification must be sufficiently open to participation and sufficiently effective to respond to a given situation of subjugation. That principle does not decide which model of order from a multi-level system to global federalism actually follows from this. I don't think such a reflexive conception of democracy is new. I think within national democratic normative orders, we also encounter fundamental conflicts over whether they can redeem their claim to justification. Just think of issues such as the conferral of citizenship rights. Many people live in countries and are being ruled over without having citizenship and political rights. And if they have political rights, they often cannot use them because an electoral system prevents them from doing so, or the lack of certain capabilities. That's where a political notion of capabilities comes in again. Such controversies and sites where the question of democracy is played out also exist above the national level, even if corresponding institutions are for the most part still at stages of development that, like the UN, reflect the post-war balance of power or relations of economic power at the global level. If we understand democracy in processual terms in such a way that it expresses the collective aspiration to subsume the exercise of rule under relations of effective justification and authorization of norms by those who are subjected to them, then to assume that this requires a demos defined in terms of a state or a nation is really to reify democracy in a way that is out of bounds with the reality we live in. The demoi, which are constituted as states, are already integrated into such diverse networks of international and transnational arbitrary rule that the congruence condition, as Michael Zürn calls it, namely that rule should be authorized by those over whom it is exercised, is no longer satisfied. Justice, and with it democracy as a practice of justice, are primarily recuperative and processual. Political justification communities are formed through social relations that already exist and are in need of regulation. Last sentence, almost. Jürgen Habermas once coined the image of besiegement or beleaguerment for the exercise of political power. Public discourses generate justifying reasons which the political system cannot ignore. The concept of justificatory power, which takes up and develops these reflections, is agnostic regarding the question of whether communicative power is generated and exercised in an institutionalized way or not. What is essential is that with it, the force towards the better argument can be exerted. I think when it comes to the question of democracy, it's always about forcing those who are privileged, those who are in a dominating position, to engage in institutions where they can no longer justify and uphold these privileges. So that is a polemical exercise. It starts often within, but maybe more often outside of these institutions. And it the task is just to generate sufficient justificatory power to constantly besiege those in power to yield to the justificatory power that is being exercised. I think this is what goes on within societies when we think about democracy as a progressive force, and this is what goes on outside of states on a transnational level if we are to think of these relations as open to democracy. For me, democracy always is a process of democratization, of expanding and equalizing justificatory power. I think that is the question of justice, and that is where the question of capabilities comes in, not in the first place as a question of well-being, but as a question of political empowerment. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, and thank you, Rainer. And now Henry will provide a short group of comments.
Yes, thank you, Rainer. It's always a delight to engage with your work, inspiring work on the right to justification. I'll try to be brief. It's a very richly argued paper. For the sake of discussion, I want to press on 2 points. One about the continuing relevance, if any, of national democracies, and one about how far the force of the better argument can take us if it sets aside any appeal to individuals' conceptions of well-being or of the good. So Rainer has set out to characterize a realistic conception of transnational democracy, and he's clarified elsewhere that he means what he means by transnational is a position that makes neither the global perspective nor the perspective of the nation state primary for justice. Rather, social institutions at whatever level must be subject to the demands of justification. Given what he's said today, though, I wonder how he will be able to maintain this position, for he seems to have built in 2 powerful kinds of pressure towards the primacy of global justice. The first of these sources of pressure is his sidelining of the congruence condition, which he came to at the end, the principle that rule should be authorized by those over whom it is exercised, or to those, using other words he had, that it claims to bind. This condition is problematized by the existence of international legal institutions, corporate actors, and NGOs that link nations in a global network, and by the fact that global interdependence means that often one's nation's actions affect many outside it. So we're pressed towards the principle that rules should be authorized by all those affected, and so towards a global basis for justification. The second element in Forst's talk that presses us towards the primacy of the global is his insistence that the first task of justice is to establish political structures in which arbitrary rule can be banished. Now, much domination and arbitrariness arises domestically within a nation whose boundaries may be taken for granted. These kinds of arbitrariness may be addressed by establishing adequate structures for contestation and participation. Yet there's another arbitrariness present in all cases of national rule, the arbitrariness of national boundaries. These pose difficulties of another kind. Nation states claim special authority to bind their own citizens to legal duties. As A. John Simmons has long argued, accounts of political authority tend to come to grief because they can't explain the basis of this supposed special connection, one that is especially problematic when, perhaps because of violent conquest, a nation's boundaries contain people who reject the legitimacy of those boundaries. Think of Israel or Northern Ireland, or of the United States of America shortly after the Mexican War. The only way to erase this fundamental form of arbitrariness, it would seem, would be to let the nation states fall away and move towards global rule. Now, I'm going to shift over to well-being, and let me bring in Martha Nussbaum's capability-based account of minimal justice by way of contrast. Nussbaum's is an account of minimal national justice. It lays down a constitutional responsibility on each nation to see to it that each citizen enjoys a threshold level of each of the central capabilities. Transposing her theory to a global government would raise serious issues of realism, since we are currently very far away from having a global government that could seriously undertake such a responsibility. But strikingly, the account that Rainer has offered us lacks any such responsibility posed in terms of individual well-being. What matters for justice, or what primarily matters for justice according to him, are structures allowing for participation and contestation. This omission of well-being might be questioned in itself, and his opening remarks, though Reiner's opening remarks set a pacific tone about this, saying that he sees his view as complementary to what the capability approach has to offer. So I'm not going to challenge it directly, but I think it's not just a complementarity. I think a conception of justice needs to have a well-being component. They're both necessary conditions. So I'd like to raise an indirect challenge by raising an issue about the force of the better argument, and then connecting that with the idea of overlapping consensus, ending by suggesting that Reiner's account really does why it needs something like the capability approach. So I agree with Reiner that the real is rational and the rational is real. That is, that the real social structures are not only informed by, but also constituted by reference to reasons informing the actions that went into constituting them. This was parts of the paper he didn't fully go through. And that the reasons, including principled ones, have real motivational efficacy. So it's not such a stretch to suppose that the better argument has some force. What we should worry about, though, as he alluded to, is whether the better argument has more force than the worse argument. Forms of collective irrationality, such as groupthink, the polarizing influences of social media, and of course the entrenched force of dominating power can give the worse argument a whole lot of force. For this reason, I think that even for the sake of adequate justification, we must go beyond the process and structure-based appeals to morality or rightness and also build justification on adequate connection to the well-being of each. This is what Rawls calls congruence, this connection between the right and the good. The kind of congruence between the right and the good that Rawls posed as a challenge for his own view when he set out to examine the potential stability of political liberalism, a challenge that would have to be met for, as he saw it, for the view to be considered to be fully justified. Although Rawls considered that his principles could gain a foothold in the principle-based interests of each individual, he also thought that for a social order to be adequately stable, it must additionally have a foothold in the broader conception of the good of each person. This is what the idea of overlapping consensus was supposed to help us imagine. And that is an idea that is as relevant to Nussbaum's account of the central capabilities as it is to Rawls's account of a well-ordered society. Contestation is essential for justice, but contestation without stability will yield chaos and war. Thank you.
With the consent of our conference organizers and in the interest of ongoing dialogue, I'm going to ask Rainer Forst to have a couple of minutes to respond to Henry's very interesting comments.
Thanks so much, awfully kind of you. These are great and big topics to raise, and I love my old friend Henry so much that I always tend to agree with everything he says, but now he criticizes me, so I can't. So I'm sorry. Just 3 points. Yes, there is a drift toward the primacy of global, or rather, as you said, I'm more comfortable to say transnational justice, because global always seems to imply there's one state, one executive, one global police force, whatever, and that's not, I think, a realistic way of thinking. What is realistic, however, is that if we think about justice, and if we lived in a world in which transnational forces of domination existed, and we had no way of recuperating and creating political institutions to subject these forms of domination to democratic rule, whatever democracy here exactly means, how imperfect it is, if that were true, we should drop the word justice. It just would no longer make sense. If we live in a world in which the major forces of economic power, of economic production, reproduction, and distribution, do no longer fit our national forms of government, then we can only compensate in national policies for injustices generated elsewhere. But compensating for injustice is not fighting injustice. It's just compensating for it. If you want to get at the roots of asymmetries and forms of domination, you have to establish forms of rule which are at least as powerful as the forms of domination that already exist. So yes, democracy justice is a recuperating form. It is forced to locate its context where economic power especially already is. And if economic power already exceeds the national boundaries, there is no way to stick to a national form of justice. As I say, national forms of justice can still do a lot to compensate for transnational, systemic, and structural injustice, but that does not mean that it gets at the roots of these structures. So we're forced, in a way, to think transnationally. Does it mean that there will be one state? No, I think these forms of domination, these forms of rule, these structures are more contextual. So we just need economic forms of justification, transnationally speaking, where the exchange of goods, the exchange of capital, the flow of capitals can be controlled, at least better controlled than at the moment. So we can aim for a more piecemeal transnational form of politics. Are borders and boundaries always arbitrary in a normative sense? Not always, I think, even though I see the force of Henry's question. I think they're always contingent, but contingency is a non-normative term. Arbitrariness is a normative term. So when is a contingent boundary an arbitrary one? It is when it is based on forms of domination, colonization, force, and so on. Then a boundary is problematically arbitrary. The existence of boundaries as contingencies is not, if they are part of a system of rule, production, cooperation, distribution that between partners has been arrived at in a justifiable way. So the existence of boundaries is only the problem if it is arbitrary in a normative sense, if it has the reality of domination inscribed in it. Now, well-being and justice, what a large topic, and I've dealt with it in a number of my writings, and one, if I may just refer, I know it sounds like an easy way out to an article I wrote called Two Pictures of Justice, where I contrast an outcome, a purely outcome-centered view of justice, and a procedural political view of justice. Now, well-being. Who would dispute that well-being is important for the question of justice? But in what way? I think, Henry thinks that you need a notion of well-being as a philosophical anchor for discussions of justice. I think, yes, you do need a philosophical anchor for discussions of justice, but it is not a notion of well-being. It's a notion of equal dignity as justificatory beings, which means that no normative order should be imposed on you, and no notion of well-being should be imposed on you that you could reciprocally reject. That means, yes, well-being is essential for determining what are the just forms of life, economic, political, and social life we ought to live under. But the justice is only generated through the autonomous determination of these forms. And there, a notion of well-being I do not see as having a foundational place. I think well-being is a contestable, highly contestable notion. I do not see it as a safe argumentative anchor, but as a topic of a lot of disagreement. That disagreement, if it is political, has to be a disagreement between justificatory equals, and that is the normative bedrock of justice. there can be a lot of discussions about the kinds of well-being that in a social order has to be furthered, supported, and realized. But the main point of justice is that no one determines which forms of well-being as politically realizable are the right ones than those living in that normative and social order. So that's why I focus on the political and moral capabilities, but not as capabilities of well-being. I think there's a larger issue here, and that's where I stop. The capability approach is an enormously productive approach in measuring development and well-being. And it has a lot to tell to theories of justice. But if tomorrow a union of the rich Arab states decides to lift a number of sub-Saharan countries up to a rather high level, comparatively speaking, of capabilities by pumping resources into it, by taking over the infrastructure, and so on, the well-being and the quality of life of the people in these countries will be enormously enhanced. Will justice have been done? No. No. It's just another form of domination exercised. A well-meaning, productive form of domination, but domination it is. Thanks.
I think you see displayed the kind of intellectual give and take that marks our association and displays our hope for the future. I know it will continue. First, let me thank Henry for his incisive remarks, and let me thank Rainer for giving us the kind of challenge that we need as we think critically about the capability approach, its relation to other perspectives, and most important, to a world of domination and inequality. On behalf of the Human Development and Capability Association, our hosts and organizers of this wonderful conference, it's a pleasure to, in the home of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, to provide Rainer with a small bust of Aristotle. HDCA Athens 2014, Rainer Forst.